In 1917, the will of Oliver Hazard Payne left his nephew Payne Whitney $63 million. dollars. It left Payne's brother Harry, the son who had stayed loyal to their father through 20 years of a family war, a single painting. One Turner canvas that Harry had once admired on his uncle's wall. Nothing else. That was the cost of loyalty in the Whitney family. A dynasty that built its fortune on the streetcars of Manhattan, $40 million dollars made in 5 years by men who leased New York its own trolley cars at prices they set themselves. What divided that fortune was not a crash or a bad bet. It was one uncle's vengeance over a marriage he could not forgive. The story begins with William Collins Whitney, and it begins in the 1890s when the streets of Manhattan ran on iron rails. In those years, New York was the largest city in America, and the system that moved its people through the avenues and the cross streets was the horse-drawn streetcar. Thousands of trolley cars threaded the blocks every morning, carrying workers, shop clerks, and millionaires from one end of the island to the other. As the decade turned, electric cars joined the horses, and the network grew until it touched almost every corner of Manhattan and the boroughs around it. But the lines that carried all those passengers were fragmented. Dozens of small companies each ran a handful of routes, and no single owner controlled the whole system. No single owner could set the price of a fare across the city or dictate the terms of a contract to the government. The network was enormous and disorganized, and that combination was the exact condition William Whitney intended to exploit. Whitney was a corporate lawyer by training, a former Secretary of the Navy under President Grover Cleveland, and a man who had moved through the highest levels of the Democratic Party for years. He was the kind of operator who treated political connections and financial leverage as two instruments of the same trade. When he turned those instruments on the streetcar industry of Manhattan, his purpose was to own the existing system and extract from it everything he could. With a small circle of partners and with the financial backing of his brother-in-law, Whitney assembled what Britannica and the corporate record of the New York streetcar companies describe as the first great holding company in the United States. The method was predatory and efficient. Buy a small streetcar company, fold it into a holding company, issue inflated stock in the holding company, and use that paper to purchase the next line. Repeat the sequence until the map belongs to you. By 1900, Whitney and his circle controlled something close to 3,000 streetcars running on 300 miles of track across Manhattan and the boroughs that surrounded it. The daily movement of the largest city in America belonged to a handful of men, and William Collins Whitney was the one who had put them together. The scale of what Whitney had assembled was without precedent. No holding company in the country had ever controlled this much of a city's daily life. Every morning, the workers who stepped onto those streetcars were riding a system that funneled its revenue through a corporate structure designed to serve one purpose: the enrichment of the men who owned it. The city moved because William Whitney permitted it to move, and the terms of that permission were set in offices where no one outside Whitney's circle had a vote. Then he turned the machine he had built into something more private, and he made his real fortune. Whitney leased the trolley cars back to his own operating companies at prices he set himself. He voted himself enormous salaries from the boards he controlled. He installed allies in every seat of authority, men who approved every contract and every disbursement he put in front of them without question. In about 5 years, according to historian Greg King's account of Gilded Age New York, William Collins, Whitney extracted close to $40 million from the streetcar system, a sum worth something near $800 million in today's money. The passengers who boarded those cars every morning paid a fare for a ride across town. What they were also paying, without any knowledge of it, was for the construction of one man's fortune on the back of the city's need to move. The streetcar system ran because it had to run, and the man who owned it took his share of every fare. That fortune had a physical address. At 871 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, Whitney hired Stanford White, the most celebrated architect in New York, and over 6 years spent $3.5 million turning a private residence into a monument. According to the architectural record of the Whitney Mansion, the ballroom stretched 63 feet long, a single, unbroken room designed for senators and presidents. Bronze gates hauled from a palace in Rome stood at the entrance to the house. The marble floor was inlaid with 10,000 individual pieces of brass, each one set by hand. Whitney entertained governors, railroad barons, and at least one sitting president inside those rooms. He walked on floors that made visible a fact no one in the city was inclined to contest: that the man who owned the transit lines of Manhattan could furnish his home with the spoils of European palaces, and New York would consider it earned. That house was more than a residence. It was the streetcar fortune made solid, a physical measure of what one man had extracted from a city's need to get from one place to another. The parties Whitney held in those rooms gathered senators and presidents and railroad barons, men who understood that the cost of the bronze gates and the marble floor had been paid by the passengers whose fares flowed upward through a holding company and into William Whitney's personal accounts. No one in those rooms had any illusion about where the money came from. And no one objected, because the guests were the kind of men who intended to do the same thing in their own industries, and several of them already had. But the streetcar fortune, enormous as it was, did not stand on William Whitney's capital alone. Behind every acquisition, behind the first purchase that set the empire in motion, there stood a second fortune, far older and far larger. It came from Standard Oil, and the man who controlled it was Whitney's brother-in-law. His name was Oliver Hazard Payne. Per the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, Payne was the treasurer of Standard Oil, one of the 4 largest individual shareholders in what was then the most profitable corporation on earth. He had built his wealth in the age of Rockefeller, in the decades when Standard Oil was assembling a monopoly on American petroleum that would make its shareholders some of the richest men in the world. Payne was not Rockefeller, but he was close enough to the center of that empire to accumulate a personal fortune that dwarfed what most industrialists of his era could imagine. And he used that fortune the way men of his generation often did, to bind the people closest to him into an orbit around his money, so that their prosperity depended on his continued goodwill. When Payne's sister Flora married William Collins Whitney, Oliver gave the couple a house on Fifth Avenue in New York and $1 million in cash as a wedding gift. It was an investment as much as a gesture. As Whitney's streetcar empire grew, and as the fortune swelled beyond anything a wedding check was designed to produce, the investment paid returns that bound the two families together with every passing year. Oliver Payne stood behind the Whitney rise as the silent source of its capital, and the Whitneys prospered because he chose to let them. Flora was the bond that made all of it personal. She was Oliver Payne's sister and William Whitney's wife, and while she lived, the alliance between the two men felt like family and not just finance. When Flora died in 1893, the living thread between the Payne fortune and the Whitney household was severed. Oliver Payne lost his sister, and in losing her, he lost the only person whose existence made his generosity toward William Whitney feel like kinship rather than commerce. What remained between the two men was money and a shared past, and neither of those was enough to survive what came next. 3 years after Flora's death, per the Schoolfield Country House study of the Payne-Whitney family, William Whitney took up with another woman and married her. Oliver Payne was consumed by the remarriage. Whether the rage was grief for his dead sister, or the humiliation of watching the man he had bankrolled replace her, or some private wound the surviving record does not name, the result was total. He demanded that Whitney give up the new wife. Whitney refused, and Oliver Payne, per that same family study, vowed to destroy him and never spoke to William Whitney again. The man who had financed the Whitney empire was now determined to dismantle the family he had made wealthy. The benefactor had become the destroyer, and the weapon he chose was not litigation, not a financial maneuver, not any of the instruments a Standard Oil shareholder had available to him in the courts. It was something more personal than any of those. Oliver Payne found his weapon in the next generation. William and Flora Whitney had 4 surviving children, 2 sons, Harry and Payne Whitney, and 2 daughters, Pauline and Dorothy. After the breach with William, the uncle went to each of them with an ultimatum that, per the Schoolfield study and corroborating records from the Encyclopedia of Women's History, was as simple as it was merciless. "Choose me over your father," he told them. "Leave his household and attach yourselves to mine. When I die, you will inherit one of the largest personal fortunes in the country. Stay with your father, and you will receive nothing from me. Not a dollar, not a share of Standard Oil, not a painting from my walls." Imagine what that choice looked like to 4 people who had grown up in the same household. Being told by their mother's own brother that they had to pick a side and live with it, knowing the uncle's fortune was large enough to reshape any life he attached it to, and knowing their father would remember their answer. Two of the children chose the uncle. Payne Whitney and Pauline crossed the line to Oliver Payne. Two stayed with their father. Harry Payne Whitney and his sister Dorothy refused to leave. It was the kind of fracture a family does not recover from. Four children, a fortune large enough to sustain all of them, and a single uncle's rage had broken the household into factions that could never be recombined. The children had not chosen between wealth and poverty. Both the father and the uncle were wealthy men. They had chosen between two patriarchs, each of whom now intended to use his own death to punish those who had picked the other side. And neither patriarch was the kind of man who would forgive or forget. Oliver Payne's fortune was Standard Oil money, patient and enormous, the kind of wealth that could wait a generation to deliver its verdict. William Whitney's was streetcar money, newer and flashier but large enough to make its own statement from the grave. William Collins, Whitney died in 1904. His will rewarded the children who had stayed. Per the estate records cited in the Schoolfield study, Harry received 1/2 of the father's estate. Dorothy received 3/10. The two who had gone to the uncle, Payne Whitney and Pauline, each received 1/10. Pauline's share came to $2.5 million, a fortune by ordinary measure, but a calculated fraction of what her loyal siblings had been given. The arithmetic was a message. William Whitney had measured his children by their loyalty, and the will paid each of them at the rate he judged they had earned. The two who had left received enough to live on, but not enough to forget that they had been weighed and found disloyal. Oliver Payne lived 13 years after William Whitney's death, 13 years in which the divided family waited for the second will to land. When he died in 1917, his own will delivered the mirror blow, per the Hudson Valley. One investigation of the will, Payne Whitney, the nephew who had chosen him, received $63 million. Harry, the nephew who had stayed with his father, received the Turner painting titled Juliet and Her Nurse, one canvas he had once admired, and nothing more. Dorothy, who had also stayed, received nothing at all. Two wills and two patriarchs, each one using his death to punish the children who had sided against him. Between the two testaments, the arithmetic of spite was complete. Every child had been measured, and every child had been paid according to the side they had chosen. The fortune that William Collins Whitney had built on the streetcars of Manhattan, and that Oliver Hazard Payne had bankrolled with Standard Oil money, had not been lost to a panic or wasted on speculation. It had been cut apart by two old men who turned their final testaments into weapons in a war their children had not started and could not end. And the money, redistributed by vengeance into two unequal branches, now passed to a generation that would spend it in ways neither patriarch could have foreseen. The larger branch went to Payne Whitney, and it became one of the most extraordinary accumulations of private wealth in the history of the country. Payne Whitney had chosen his uncle, received the inheritance that came with that choice, and combined it with what he earned through his own investments. He put money into banks, into New York real estate, and into thoroughbred racehorses. The fortune compounded for a decade, growing at a rate that multiplied the already enormous starting figure beyond anything the uncle's will had contemplated. And then, on a late summer afternoon in 1927, Payne Whitney walked onto a tennis court and collapsed. He was dead within 25 minutes, struck down at 51 by a sudden heart attack. The accounting of what he left behind staggered the country. Per the New York Times, his estate was appraised at $179 million, the largest ever recorded in the United States at that time. The number was the proof of what the uncle's favoritism had built. A single nephew, chosen over his brother for the crime of loyalty, had taken the inheritance and in one generation multiplied it into something the country had never seen before. The newspapers printed the figure, and the public tried to comprehend what it meant. That one man, dead at 51, had left behind more money than entire industries were worth. But Payne Whitney had been doing something else with that fortune in the years before his death, something that would define his name far beyond any figure on an appraisal. He had been giving it away. In 1923, per the New York Public Library's records, Payne Whitney wrote a single check for $12 million to the library, the largest gift in its history at that time. He refused to let them attach his name to it. No wing named Whitney, no reading room, no inscription. The money arrived, and the donor asked to remain invisible. 4 years later, on the tennis court, he was dead. There is something worth pausing on in that refusal. $12 million was, at the time, a sum large enough to reshape the library's future. The donor had every reason to expect recognition, a wing bearing his family name, a plaque in the lobby, some permanent reminder that the money had come from a Whitney. He asked for none of it. The check arrived, the library accepted it, and Payne Whitney's name appeared nowhere in the building. Whatever had driven him to give, it was not the need to be remembered for the giving. He gave more than $20 million to a New York hospital, endowing what became the Payne Whitney Clinic, among the first dedicated psychiatric treatment facilities of its kind in the country. He gave $1 million to Yale University, and after his death, his estate funded the construction of the Payne Whitney Gymnasium on the Yale campus in New Haven. The money flowed out of that branch of the family as if Payne Whitney had decided, somewhere along the way, that the purpose of inheriting an enormous fortune was to spend it on things that would outlast the family that earned it. He built no private monuments. He endowed institutions, and the institutions survived him. Harry Payne Whitney, the brother who had stayed with his father and been left a single painting by his uncle, was not destroyed by the split. He took what his father's will had given him, combined it with the wealth his wife brought to the marriage, and built something that had nothing to do with streetcars or Standard Oil. Per the National Museum of Racing, Harry Payne Whitney assembled the greatest thoroughbred racing stable in America. He bred horses on farms in Kentucky and on Long Island, pouring time and money into bloodlines and training with a patience that the streetcar fortune had never required. Over a career that spanned decades, his horses produced almost 200 stakes winners, a record no other stable in America could match. Harry had taken the uncle's insult and answered it not with resentment or litigation, but with a life built on something the uncle's money could not touch. In 1915, Harry sent an untested filly named Regret to the Kentucky Derby at Churchill Downs in Louisville. No female horse had ever won the race. The field did not expect her to contend. Regret ran the 1.25 miles through the mud and crossed the finish line first, the first filly in the history of the Kentucky Derby to beat the colts. The crowd at Churchill Downs watched a horse that the racing world had dismissed run past every favorite on the card, and the moment remains one of the most celebrated in the history of American racing. Harry Payne Whitney died in 1930 at his home on Long Island, surrounded by the stables and the farms and the trophies of a life spent in thoroughbred racing. Per his probate, his estate was valued at close to $78 million. It was a smaller figure than his brother's $179 million appraisal, but the comparison misses the point. $71 million is not the estate of a ruined man. The uncle's punishment had failed to do what it was designed to do. Harry had been cut from the Payne fortune, handed one canvas as a calculated insult, and he had built his own wealth and his own reputation without the uncle's money behind him. Then his wife did something that none of the Whitneys, on either branch of the divided family, had attempted before. She tried to give away not money, but RT. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was a Vanderbilt by birth, a sculptor by vocation, and she had spent years collecting works by living American artists at a time when the New York art world looked across the Atlantic for everything it considered serious. By 1929, she had assembled almost 700 paintings and sculptures by Americans. Per the museum's founding history, a body of work she believed the city's great institutions had refused to see for what it was. She carried her offer to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the grandest cultural institution in the country, housed in its vast building on Fifth Avenue in Central Park. The proposal was straightforward: almost 700 works of American art, plus $5 million to construct a dedicated wing for the collection. The art and the money to house it, offered without conditions, from a woman whose own name carried the weight of two of the wealthiest families in New York. It was the kind of offer a museum receives once in a generation, if it is fortunate. The Metropolitan refused. Per the founding history of the Whitney Museum, the director told Gertrude's assistant that the institution had no interest. The account records that he cut the conversation short with a single line: "We have a cellar full of those things already." Consider what that refusal carried for Gertrude. She had spent years building the collection. By marriage, she carried the Whitney name, and by birth, the Vanderbilt one. She was offering not just art, but the money to display it. And the most prominent museum in America had told her that the work she believed in was basement inventory, unworthy of wall space. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney went home from that meeting and did what the Whitneys, at their best, had always done with their money. She put it to US. In Greenwich Village, on West 8th Street in Manhattan, She rented a set of brownstone buildings and converted them into a museum of her own. She hired a director, organized the collection, and opened the doors. On the 18th of November, 1931, the Whitney Museum of American Art received its first visitors. 4,000 people walked through the galleries on opening day to see the collection the Metropolitan had rejected. The paintings that a museum director had called cellar material were hanging on walls built with Whitney money in a building founded on the refusal of a larger institution to accept them. The rejected art had found its own house, and that house would outlast every person who had been involved in the refusal. But the museum was not the last place the Whitney fortune would go. The third heir of the giveaway generation was Payne Whitney's son, and his name was John Hay Whitney, known to everyone as Jock. Jock Whitney inherited a share of the enormous estate his father had left, and he spent it the way ambitious men of his era spent large fortunes, on ventures that matched the scale of the money. He served as the American ambassador to the United Kingdom under President Eisenhower, a posting that carried the kind of social prestige the Whitney name had always attracted. His money went into Technicolor and helped bankroll the production of Gone with the Wind. He owned racehorses, served on boards, and funded charitable foundations with the ease of a man who had never known a world without money in it. Jock Whitney moved through the world as a man for whom money had always been a tool, never a constraint. And then he did the thing that would cost the family its single largest documented sum on any one venture. In 1958, Jock Whitney bought the New York Herald Tribune. The paper had been, for most of the 20th century, one of the great American newspapers, a publication that had shaped the way New York thought about itself and the way the country thought about New York. By the time Jock acquired it, the Tribune was losing readers to television news and losing advertising revenue to competing publications, and the economics of daily journalism were turning against it. Jock believed that the right investment, applied with enough commitment and sustained long enough, could reverse the decline. According to the Herald Tribune's own closing record, he poured $39.5 million into the newspaper over the next 8 years, modernizing its printing, investing in its editorial staff, subsidizing its daily operations with his own money. The investment was not enough. The Herald Tribune published its final edition in 1966, and the money Jock had put into it was gone. It remains the largest single documented loss of Whitney money on any one undertaking. Jock Whitney had not been cheated by a partner or misled by bad advice. He had studied the newspaper, believed it could be saved, and invested everything his conviction demanded. The paper died anyway. Its readers had gone to television and they were not coming back, and the $39.5 million Jock spent trying to hold them could not reverse what the economics of American media had already decided. The heirs who spent the Whitney fortune did not always spend it well. Sometimes the money left because a Whitney picked a cause, and the cause was already dying, and no fortune, however large, was enough to keep it alive. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney died in 1942. Per the court accounting of her estate in 1943, she left behind $10.5 million, a fraction of what the family had held at its peak. She bequeathed $2.5 million more to the museum she had founded, one final transfer of private wealth into public art. She had entered the Whitney family as a Vanderbilt heiress and left it as the founder of an institution, and the institution was worth more to the world than anything her personal estate contained. The streetcar empire had long since fallen. The holding company William Whitney built had gone into receivership during the Panic of 1907, 3 years after his death, and the collapse of the streetcar empire had not dragged the family down with it, because by then the family's money had already moved on to other investments. What had sustained the Whitneys was the uncle's Standard Oil fortune, and the uncle had used that fortune as a weapon, and the weapon had split the family into two branches that never reunited. The money that survived the split had gone to hospitals, libraries, a university, a gymnasium, a museum, and a newspaper that no longer existed. And yet, inside what looked like total dissolution, something had survived that none of the Whitneys could have predicted. The money was gone, dispersed into institutions and lost causes, and the vast machinery of American philanthropy. But a few of the things the money had purchased along the way had been gaining value on museum walls and in private collections, appreciating at a rate that would have astonished the people who first bought them. On the 5th of May, 2004, a small painting by Pablo Picasso went to auction at Sotheby's in New York City. It was a canvas called Boy with a Pipe, a portrait of a young man in a garland of roses, and Jock Whitney had bought it in 1950 for $30,000. On that spring afternoon, per the Sotheby's sale record, the painting sold for $104 million, and for a moment, it became the most expensive painting ever sold at auction anywhere in the world. The calculation was staggering. $30,000 in 1950, $104 million 54 years later. One canvas, bought with Whitney money half a century earlier for the price of a modest house, had become worth 10 times the entire estate that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney left behind when she died. A single painting had outrun the probated wealth of the woman who built an entire museum. The institutions the heirs built with the money they gave away still stand. The Payne-Whitney Clinic treats patients in New York. On the Yale campus, the Payne-Whitney Gymnasium holds its place. The Helen Hay Whitney Foundation funds medical research. The Greentree Foundation carries the family's philanthropic work forward. And every summer at the Saratoga Racecourse in upstate New York, the Whitney Stakes is run for a purse of $1 million, a thoroughbred race held without interruption since 1928, named for the family that shaped American racing for a generation. The winner of this story is the museum that the Metropolitan Museum of Art refused to accept. Built from Gertrude's rejected collection and her $5 million, the Whitney Museum of American Art stands today on Gansevoort Street in the Meatpacking District of Manhattan, in a building designed for the 21st century. It holds more than 25,000 works in its permanent collection. Per the museum's financial statements, it sits on assets valued at more than $1 billion. The collection the director of the Metropolitan dismissed as seller material is now one of the most important bodies of American art in the world. The fortune the Whitney family gave away is worth more today than the fortune ever was. Not the streetcar money, not the Standard Oil inheritance, not the racing stable or the newspaper or the gymnasium or the clinic. The museum alone. The one institution born from a refusal, from a director who said the art was not worth his walls, surpasses all of it. That is the final shape of the Whitney fortune. A family that built its wealth by self-dealing on the trolley lines of New York, that saw its wealth divided by a single uncle's spite, and that watched the next generation give away what spite had not already scattered. No market crash destroyed the money, no single disaster consumed it. The streetcar empire fell, but the family survived the fall. What divided the fortune was Oliver Hazard Payne's will, one document that punished loyalty and rewarded obedience, and what dissolved the rest was 3 generations of heirs who believed that money was for using, for horses, for art, for a hospital, for a newspaper, for a museum that a great institution had refused to build. The Whitneys did not hold on to their money, but the thing they built with the part they let go has outlasted every dollar they kept.